You're told real estate is the ultimate investment, but nobody warns you about the ghosts that come with the deed. In 1968, a desperate 24-year-old woman bought a decaying lakeside cabin for a single $20 bill. What she unearthed beneath the floorboards didn't just make her dangerously rich, it rewrote her entire bloodline. Today, at 82 years old, Clara Jenkins sits in the sunroom of her sprawling estate in upstate New York, her frail hands resting on a silver-handled walking cane. She commands a fortune that Forbes frequently attempts to quantify, always falling short by a few $100 million. But if you ask Clara where her life truly began, she won't point to Wall Street, and she certainly won't point to a silver spoon. She will point a shaky, veined finger toward a frozen, forgotten spit of land on the rocky shores of Lake Superior, just outside the logging town of Grand Marais, Minnesota. The year was 1968. Clara was 24, utterly alone, and running on fumes. Both her parents had died in a tragic factory fire in Chicago a year prior, leaving her with a mountain of inherited debt and a hollow chest full of grief. With creditors breathing down her neck, Clear's throat, Clara had packed her life into a rusted 1959 Ford Fairlane and driven north until the engine finally seized on a gravel road by the lake. She had exactly $30.40 to her name. Clear's throat. She was sleeping in the back seat, eating cold canned beans and shivering through the bitter October nights. Desperation makes people do irrational things. For Clara, that irrational thing happened on a gloomy Tuesday morning inside the Cook County Courthouse. She had gone inside just to use the heating, but down the hall a property tax auction was taking place. Local loggers and land developers sat in wooden pews bidding hundreds of dollars for timber rights and commercial plots. Clara sat in the back, rubbing her freezing hands together, watching the proceedings with detached apathy. Then the auctioneer, a burly man named Sheriff Bill Donovan, cleared his throat and held up a faded, yellowed file. Next up, Parcel 402, Miller's Point. Donovan announced, his voice dropping an octave. A strange, heavy silence fell over the room. The loggers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some muttered to one another. Others suddenly found the ceiling tiles incredibly interesting. 3 acres of lakefront and 1 existing structure. "Starting bid is $50, Donovan called out. No one raised a paddle. "All right, 30? Silence. The men in the room looked actively repulsed by the offering. 20? The sheriff sighed, looking exhausted. "Do I hear $20 to clear this eyesore off the county's books?" Clara didn't know what Miller's Point is. She didn't know the local legends or the whispered warnings that kept the townspeople away from the peninsula. All she knew was that $20 was less than what she had in her pocket. An existing structure meant 4 walls and a roof. It meant she wouldn't freeze to death in her Ford. Before she could talk herself out of it, her hand shot up into the air. Sheriff Donovan stopped dead. He stared at the thin, shivering girl in the back row. "Miss, are you sure?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. "You know whose property this was, right?" "I don't care," Clara said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I have $20. The gavel came down with a hollow thud. "Sold." When Clara approached the clerk's desk to hand over her crumpled $20 bill, Sheriff Donovan pulled her aside. His weathered face was grim. "Listen to me, kid. That land belonged to Elias Caldwell. He was a bad man, a recluse. They hauled him off to the state asylum 10 years ago, screaming about people coming out of the water to steal his soul. The cabin has been rotting ever since. There's no power, no plumbing, and folks around here, well, they say the soil itself is poisoned. You can't live out there." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Clara replied, clutching the deed to her chest like a shield. When she finally hitched a ride out to Miller's Point that afternoon, Clara realized the sheriff hadn't been exaggerating. The property was a nightmare. The cabin sat at the very edge of a jagged cliff dropping off into the churning slate-gray waters of Lake Superior. The structure was practically collapsing in on itself, smothered by overgrown, sickly-looking pine trees that blocked out the sun. The windows were shattered. The roof was missing a third of its shingles, and the front door was hanging by a single rusted hinge. It looked less like a home and more like a decaying animal carcass left out in the woods. But as Clara stepped inside, crunching over broken glass and dead leaves, she felt a strange, inexplicable pull. The air inside the cabin was freezing, yet it felt heavy, almost expectant. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor was made of massive, uneven oak planks. In the corner sat a massive cast-iron wood stove. She spent her first week just trying to make the place survivable. She chopped dead wood, patched the broken windows with cardboard and duct tape, and scrubbed a decade of grime off the floor. The isolation was absolute. At night, the wind howling off Lake Superior sounded like human voices screaming in the dark. Clara was terrified, but she was also too exhausted to flee. The townspeople kept their distance. The only person who spoke to her was Beatrice, the elderly woman who ran the local diner in town. When Clara walked 3 miles into town to buy flour and matches with her remaining $12, Beatrice handed her a thermos of hot coffee on the house. "You be careful out there, girl," Beatrice whispered, glancing nervously out the diner window. Caldwell didn't go crazy from the isolation. He went crazy because of what he brought with him to that cabin. Nobody knows what it was, but men in nice suits used to come through town asking about him in the 40s. Dangerous-looking men. Whatever Caldwell was hiding, he took the secret to his grave. Clara brushed it off as small-town ghost stories. She had no idea that Beatrice's warning was the terrifying literal truth. By mid-November, the brutal Minnesota winter began to show its teeth. The temperature plummeted to single digits, and the snow started to pile up against the rotting walls of the cabin. Clara spent most of her days huddled near the wood stove, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, trying to keep the fire alive. It was during the first major blizzard of the season that the cabin finally gave way. The wind was shrieking off the lake at 60 miles an hour, battering the structure. Around 2 a.m., a massive gust tore a section of the patched roof clean off. Freezing rain and snow immediately began pouring into the cabin, pooling on the oak floorboards near the center of the main room. Clara leapt up in the dark, her heart hammering in her throat. She grabbed a bucket and a rusted crowbar she had found in the shed, desperately trying to pry up a warped, water-damaged floorboard before the moisture could rot the joists and collapse the entire floor beneath her. She jammed the crowbar into a wide seam between 2 thick oak planks and threw her entire body weight against it. The wood groaned, splintered, and finally snapped upward with a violent crack, sending Clara tumbling backward onto the floor. Panting, she crawled back to the hole to inspect the damage, but as she shined her dim, battery-powered flashlight into the cavity beneath the floor, she froze. The space between the joists wasn't filled with dirt or insulation. Sitting perfectly nestled in the darkness, wrapped in layers of thick, waterproof oilcloth, was a large, heavy object. Clara's breath plumed in the freezing air. She reached down her fingers, brushing against the cold, stiff fabric. It was shockingly heavy, easily 40 lb. Grunting with effort, she hoisted the bundle out of the hole and dragged it onto the floor beside the wood stove. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, not from the freezing temperature, but from a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. She grabbed a knife from her meager kitchen supplies and began slicing through the hardened layers of oilcloth. Beneath the fabric lay a massive rectangular strongbox made of solid cast iron. It was completely unmarked, secured by a heavy brass padlock that had turned green with oxidation. Clara didn't hesitate. The survival instinct that had kept her alive this long shifted into overdrive. She grabbed her hammer and brought it down on the rusted brass padlock with all her remaining strength. Clang, clang, clang. On the 4th strike, the brittle metal shattered the locking mechanism, snapping apart. She pulled the iron latch back and slowly opened the heavy lid. Clara stared into the box, her mind completely blanking, unable to process what her eyes were seeing. The box wasn't filled with gold coins or cash. It was meticulously organized, divided into 3 distinct sections. In the first section lay stacks of crisp, immaculate paper documents. Clara picked one up, bringing it close to the flashlight. It was a United States Treasury bearer bond. The denomination printed in the corner was $10,000. She frantically flipped through the stack. There were at least 100 of them. Over $1 million in unregistered, untraceable bonds dated 1928. In the second section was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Clara opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, names, dates, and massive sums of money transferred between Chicago, New York, and Geneva. But it wasn't just a financial ledger. It was a blackmail diary. Elias Caldwell hadn't just been a recluse. The entries detailed payoffs to judges, politicians, and police chiefs during the height of the Prohibition era. He had been the chief accountant and money launderer for one of the most ruthless syndicates in the Midwest. But it was the third section of the box that caused the blood to completely drain from Clara's face, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. Resting at the bottom of the iron strongbox was a small velvet pouch. Inside was a tarnished silver locket and a sepia-toned photograph from the 1930s. Clara picked up the photograph. It was a picture of a young woman standing in front of a grand Chicago estate holding a newborn baby. The woman had high cheekbones, deep-set dark eyes, and a distinct small birthmark on the left side of her jaw. Clara dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting erratic shadows against the cabin walls. The woman in the photograph was identical to Clara. It was like looking into a mirror. She even had the exact same birthmark. Trembling, Clara picked up the only other document in the velvet pouch, a folded yellowed birth certificate. It was issued in Cook County, Illinois, in 1935. The name of the mother was listed as Margaret Jenkins. The father's name was listed as Elias Caldwell. The baby in the photograph, the child born to a ruthless mob accountant and a Chicago socialite, was Clara's father. Elias Caldwell wasn't just a crazy old man who had died in an asylum. Clear's throat. He was her grandfather. Her entire life, her parents had told her they were poor, that they had no family, that they were alone in the world. But it was a lie, a massive, terrifying lie meant to hide them from whoever Caldwell had stolen this fortune from. Her father hadn't died in a random factory fire. He had been hunted, and Clara had just bought a neon sign pointing right at herself. Suddenly, the deafening howl of the blizzard outside was interrupted by a sound that made Clara's heart stop entirely. Crunch. It was the heavy, distinct sound of a boot crushing through the snow and broken glass on her front porch. The wind screamed, but the sound came again, closer this time. Crunch. Clara scrambled backward, clutching the cold iron of the strongbox, her eyes fixed on the rotting front door. The beam of her dropped flashlight illuminated the rusted doorknob. Slowly, deliberately, the knob began to turn. The rusted doorknob protested with a harsh, metallic squeal, turning inch by agonizing inch. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the heavy iron crowbar, her knuckles turning bone white, and pressed herself against the shadows of the wood stove. The door violently burst open, slamming against the interior wall, and a massive figure stepped into the cabin. It wasn't a ghost, it was a man, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, wearing a thick wool overcoat dusted in fresh snow. A wide-brimmed fedora cast a dark shadow over his face, but as he stepped into the dim beam of Clara's fallen flashlight, she saw the cold, dead eyes of a professional killer. In his right hand, resting casually by his side, was a suppressed Colt M1911 pistol. This was Victor Moretti, a ruthless enforcer for the Chicago-based Costello Syndicate, the very same organization Clara's grandfather had betrayed. The syndicate had never stopped looking for Elias Caldwell's missing ledger, patiently monitoring the property deeds of Cook County for decades. When Clara bought the land for $20, she had tripped a silent alarm that echoed all the way to the Chicago underworld. "Well, well," Victor rasped, his voice like gravel grinding together. He kicked the door shut behind him, sealing them in the freezing room. His eyes darted to the gaping hole in the floorboards and then to the shattered cast-iron strongbox. A cruel smile stretched across his face. The old man's treasure chest. So, the rumors were true. Now, step away from the box, sweetheart, and maybe I'll make this quick. He didn't know who she was. To Victor, she was just a lucky squatter who had stumbled onto a mafia gold mine. Clara didn't speak. Her mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour, fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She looked at the heavy strongbox, then at the man blocking her only exit. She had lost her parents. She had lost her home. She was freezing, starving, and cornered. But as the blood of Elias Caldwell pumped through her veins, terror rapidly crystallized into absolute blinding rage. "I said move!" Victor barked, raising the pistol. He took a heavy, confident step forward. That was his fatal mistake. Victor stepped exactly where Clara had previously pried up the floorboards. The surrounding oak planks had been rotting from beneath for 10 years, compromised by moisture and neglect. Without the central joist support that Clara had compromised, the floor simply could not bear the weight of a 200 lb enforcer. With a deafening crack, the timber splintered beneath Victor's boots. He plunged waist-deep into the crawlspace, crying out in shock as jagged shards of oak drove into his thighs. The suppressed pistol flew from his grip, skittering across the floor and disappearing into the dark corners of the cabin. Clara didn't hesitate for a microsecond. She lunged forward, not toward the door, but toward the intruder. Gripping the crowbar with both hands, she swung it like a baseball bat, connecting sickeningly with the side of Victor's knee that was still pinned above the floorboards. He let out a breathless howl of agony, his arms flailing as he tried to pull himself out of the trap. Clara scrambled back, scooped up her heavy wool blanket, and frantically wrapped it around the iron strongbox, muffling the clinking of the bearer bonds and the locket. She hoisted the 40 lb bundle against her chest, staggered to her feet, and bolted out the front door into the screaming blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical blow, instantly freezing the tears on her cheeks. She couldn't take her 1959 Ford. The engine was completely dead. But as she stumbled through the deep snowbanks, she saw it, a sleek, dark Lincoln Continental idling in the tree line, its exhaust billowing into the snowy night. Victor's car. She threw the strongbox into the passenger seat, slid behind the wheel, and locked the doors just as Victor emerged from the cabin, dragging his injured leg and screaming curses into the wind. Clara slammed the car into drive, stomped on the gas pedal, and the heavy Lincoln tore down the gravel road, leaving Miller's Point and the ghost of her grandfather behind in the storm. Clara didn't drive into Grand Marais. She knew the syndicate would have eyes everywhere, and she couldn't trust the local police, not when her grandfather's ledger detailed the systemic corruption of law enforcement across the entire Midwest. She drove through the blinding snow for 4 terrifying hours, white-knuckling the steering wheel of the stolen Lincoln Continental until she finally crossed the city limits into Duluth, Minnesota. She abandoned the car in a snowy alleyway, wiping down the steering wheel, and checked into a filthy, cash-only motel near the train station under a fake name. She dragged the heavy iron strongbox into the room, pushed a solid oak dresser against the door, and closed the yellowed blinds. Only then did she collapse onto the stained carpet, gasping for air, her body shaking violently from the aftermath of survival. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale, weak light through the cracks in the blinds, Clara sat cross-legged on the sagging mattress. Spread out around her was the undeniable proof of her dark inheritance. $1 million in unregistered United States Treasury bearer bonds, her father's birth certificate, the silver locket, and the black leather ledger. She opened the ledger, tracing the handwritten ink with a trembling finger. The names leapt off the page, reading like a who's who of American power and corruption. Judge Arthur Dempsey, $50,000 for dismissed racketeering charges, 1932. Senator Thomas Gallagher, $120,000 in campaign funding laundered through dummy logging corporations in the Pacific Northwest, 1934. James Costello, syndicate boss, the man who ordered the executions of anyone connected to the missing funds. As she read the detailed entries, a horrifying realization washed over her. Clara realized then that her parents' factory fire in Chicago wasn't a tragic accident caused by faulty wiring. They had been hunted. Her father had tried to live a quiet, impoverished life to protect her, hiding his true identity. But the Costello family had found them anyway. They had murdered her parents in cold blood, burning the building to the ground to cover their tracks. But they hadn't found the ledger because her grandfather, Elias Caldwell, had hidden it 300 miles away in a desolate lakeside cabin. Clara had a choice. She could run, change her name, and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, exactly like her father did. Or she could use the weapons Elias Caldwell had left her to burn their empire to the ground. She chose to fight. Using $3,000 in mafia cash she had found in the glove box of Victor's Lincoln, Clara bought a one-way train ticket to New York City. 2 days later, she walked into the towering glass and steel lobby of a prestigious Manhattan law firm. She still looked bruised and exhausted, clutching a worn leather satchel to her chest, but her eyes held a terrifying clarity. The front desk receptionist tried to dismiss her, but Clara simply unzipped the satchel, pulled out a crisp 1928 $10,000 bearer bond, and laid it flat on the mahogany desk. "I need to see your senior managing partner," Clara said, her voice dead flat. "Right now." Within 10 minutes, she was sitting across from Philip Rosenthal, a notoriously ruthless corporate defense attorney known for representing oil tycoons and disgraced senators. He looked at the bearer bond, authenticated it with a jeweler's loop, and then looked at the fierce 24-year-old girl sitting across from him. "Where exactly did you get this?" "Miss Jenkins?" Rosenthal asked, raising a silver eyebrow. "I have 99 more of them," Clara replied coldly. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I need you to set up a dead man's switch. And then, Mr. Rosenthal, I need you to arrange a sit-down with the most dangerous men in Chicago." Over the next month, Philip Rosenthal orchestrated the most high-stakes classified negotiation of the decade. He secured the bearer bonds in an impenetrable Swiss vault and verified Clara's lineage, making her the legal heir to the Caldwell estate. But more importantly, he arranged a highly secretive meeting in a private boardroom overlooking Central Park. When Clara walked into that room, she was no longer the shivering girl from the cabin. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back sharply, exuding the cold, calculating aura of her grandfather. Sitting across from her was Dominic Costello, the grandson of the syndicate boss, alongside two high-powered political fixers representing the corrupt families named in the ledger. They looked at Clara with a mixture of utter contempt and deep underlying anxiety. "You have no idea who you're messing with, little girl," Dominic sneered, leaning over the glass table, his bodyguards shifting uncomfortably by the door. "You hand over the book, or you don't leave this city breathing." Clara didn't blink. She reached into her leather briefcase and tossed a thick stack of photocopied pages onto the center of the table. "Here is the reality of your situation, gentlemen," Clara said, her voice echoing with commanding authority. "The original ledger is currently sitting in a secure vault in Geneva. I have retained legal counsel with a strict standing order. If I am harmed, if I am threatened, or if I so much as disappear for 48 hours, the contents of this book will be simultaneously mailed to the FBI, the IRS, and the front page of the New York Times." She leaned in, her dark eyes locking onto Dominic's, refusing to look away. "This book contains the exact banking routes, offshore accounts, and bribery networks your families used to build your so-called legitimate empires. If it goes public, your grandfather's legacy is completely destroyed. Your politicians go to federal prison. Your assets are seized by the government. You lose absolutely everything." The room fell suffocatingly silent. The men realized with creeping, undeniable horror that they had been entirely outplayed by a 24-year-old orphan. She held their lives in the palm of her hand. "What exactly do you want?" one of the political fixers choked out, loosening his silk tie. Clara outlined her terms with absolute precision. Absolute immunity. A guarantee that the Costello syndicate would formally and permanently cut all ties to her and her bloodline. Asset laundering. The $1 million in bearer bonds were to be legally legitimized through the syndicate's shell companies completely tax-free by Friday. The confession, a sealed written admission regarding the factory fire that killed her parents, held as collateral by Philip Rosenholz. They had no choice but to agree. The mutually assured destruction was far too airtight. Clara walked out of that Manhattan boardroom with her life secured, her fortune completely sanitized, and the restless ghosts of her parents finally avenged. Today, at 82 years old, Clara Jenkins sits in the sunroom of her sprawling estate looking out over the water. She never married, instead pouring her formidable energy into building a massive philanthropic empire. The Jenkins Foundation now funds orphanages, hospitals, and community centers across Chicago, entirely financed by the blood money her grandfather had stolen from the mob. She took the darkest, most corrupt secret of the 1920s underworld and actively weaponized it for good. As for the rotting, cursed cabin on Miller's Point, Clara never sold the land. Instead, she spent millions tearing down the decaying wood and reinforcing the jagged cliffside. She built a stunning modern fortress of glass and steel right over the exact spot where the cast-iron strongbox was hidden beneath the floorboards. It stands as a towering monument to survival, a permanent reminder that sometimes the things buried in the dark aren't just meant to haunt us. They are meant to arm us for the war ahead. She holds the tarnished silver locket in her frail, veined hands, snapping it open to look at the picture of her grandmother and her infant father. A small, satisfied smile touches her lips as she looks out over the freezing, slate-gray waters of Lake Superior. The syndicate is gone, reduced to ash indictments and history books, but the Caldwell bloodline survived against all odds. She made absolutely sure of it. Did Clara's incredible journey from a freezing, desperate girl to a formidable empire builder leave you speechless? Sometimes the darkest family secrets hold the key to our ultimate liberation. If you love this thrilling, true-life survival story, please hit that like button and share it with your friends to keep these hidden histories alive. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life mysteries and dramatic tales. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an adventure.